The House chamber hummed with tension as Representative Jasmine Crockett approached the podium. C-SPAN cameras zoomed in on the freshman Democrat from Texas, her braided hair pulled back, wearing a striking purple suit that stood out against the sea of dark blues and grays on the House floor. Across the chamber, Speaker Mike Johnson sat rigidly in his chair, scrolling through his phone, seemingly unconcerned about the 5 minutes of floor time allotted to the outspoken Congresswoman. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her voice clear and measured. The chamber quieted as her tone commanded attention. "Today, I rise not as a Democrat speaking to a Republican, but as an American addressing a fundamental breach of public trust." Johnson glanced up briefly, his expression a practiced mask of polite disinterest. This was routine, another opposition member using floor time for political theater. He nodded slightly to acknowledge her and returned to his phone. Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "Last week, you stood at that very podium and assured the American people that the new border legislation was crafted with, and I quote, full transparency and unprecedented bipartisan input. I have in my possession documents that not only contradict that statement, but reveal a disturbing pattern of deliberate misinformation presented to members of this body." Now, Johnson looked up fully, his brow furrowing slightly. Several representatives nearby stopped their conversations, turning toward Crockett. "These documents," she said, holding up a folder emblazoned with the House seal, "contain evidence that the final bill was secretly altered after committee approval, with critical enforcement provisions removed and new loopholes inserted without notification to the minority members who had negotiated in good faith." The chamber's background murmur intensified. Johnson set down his phone, sitting up straighter as Republican whips began moving through the aisles, whispering to members. "But more troubling than the deception," Crockett continued, her voice cutting through the growing noise, "is what these documents reveal about who actually wrote these changes." She paused, making direct eye contact with Johnson across the chamber. "Mr. Speaker, would you like to tell this body why verbatim language from private industry lobbyists appears in sections of this bill that you personally certified were written by your staff?" The room fell into a shocked silence. Johnson's face drained of color as he motioned urgently to the parliamentarian. Camera operators swiveled between Crockett's composed determination and Johnson's visible discomfort. "Point of order, Mr. Speaker," called out the Republican Majority Leader, attempting to interrupt. "I still have 4 minutes and 20 seconds remaining," Crockett stated calmly, "and I intend to use them." What happened in those remaining minutes would send shockwaves through Congress and completely upend the power dynamics of Washington. Before we dive into the explosive evidence that Crockett revealed next, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more exclusive political analysis that exposes what really happens behind the scenes in Washington. Jasmine Crockett had not come to Congress to play by the traditional rules. A civil rights attorney before winning her Texas seat in 2022, she had built her reputation on methodical preparation and a fearless approach to confronting power. Unlike many freshman representatives who spent their early terms quietly learning the system, Crockett had immediately established herself as someone who did her homework and wasn't afraid to use it. Crockett approaches Congress like she approached the courtroom, noted her former law partner in a Texas Tribune profile earlier that year. She gathers evidence, builds an airtight case, and delivers it without flinching, regardless of who's sitting on the other side. This approach had earned her respect among progressive Democrats, but also made her a target for conservative media, who frequently characterized her as aggressive and confrontational. Her response to such criticism, delivered during a CNN interview, had quickly gone viral. "When men are thorough and direct, they're called effective. When I do the same, they call me aggressive. I'll keep being aggressive for the people who elected me." Across the chamber sat Mike Johnson, who had ascended to the speakership through a chaotic process after Kevin McCarthy's removal. The Louisiana Republican had positioned himself as a steady, religious conservative who could unify the fractured GOP caucus. His mild manner and reputation for personal decorum had initially earned him goodwill from both colleagues and the press. Johnson represents a return to civility, Fox News host Sean Hannity had declared after his election as Speaker. He's a constitutionalist who believes in transparent governance and honest debate. But 7 months into his speakership, that honeymoon period had given way to increasing criticism about his leadership style. Moderate Republicans privately complained about being sidelined, while Democratic leaders openly accused him of breaking commitments made during negotiations. The border security legislation at the center of today's confrontation had been trumpeted by Johnson as his signature bipartisan achievement. After months of deadlock, the bill had passed with support from moderate Democrats and nearly all Republicans. Johnson had spent the past week on a media tour celebrating this success as proof that Congress can still work across the aisle to solve America's pressing challenges. What remained unknown to the public until now was that serious questions had emerged about how the final text of the bill had been developed and whether promises made during negotiations had been honored. The stakes of this confrontation extended far beyond a single piece of legislation. With midterm elections approaching and control of Congress hanging in the balance, questions of leadership integrity could reshape the political landscape. For Republicans, any suggestion that their speaker had engaged in deceptive practices threatened their broader campaign message of governmental reform and transparency. This isn't just about policy disagreement, political science professor Melissa Harris Perry had noted that morning on MSNBC, unaware of what would unfold hours later. The deeper issue is whether our legislative process has become so fundamentally broken that even bipartisan agreements can't be trusted. For Johnson, the personal stakes were enormous. As Speaker, he had staked his reputation on being a man of faith and integrity who could restore trust in congressional leadership. Any substantiated accusation of deliberate deception would undermine not just his policy agenda, but the very foundation of his political identity. For Crockett, the risks were equally significant. Directly challenging the Speaker on the House floor with accusations of this magnitude was a bold move that would either cement her reputation as a fearless advocate for accountability or expose her to accusations of overreach if her evidence proved less compelling than promised. The committee room reflected these tensions. Republican members sat protectively near Johnson, occasionally leaning over to whisper advice. Democratic representatives watched attentively, aware that Crockett's performance would reflect on the entire party. As Crockett prepared to present her evidence, the historical weight of the moment was lost on no one. A freshman congresswoman was directly challenging the Speaker with allegations of deception in the legislative process, a confrontation that would either fizzle into a footnote or become a defining moment in contemporary political accountability. Johnson straightened his tie and leaned toward the parliamentarian, perhaps seeking procedural grounds to interrupt Crockett's remaining time. But before he could act, she continued her methodical presentation. Before we examine the altered bill text, Crockett said, let's establish the context that makes these changes so troubling. I draw the chamber's attention to Exhibit A, Crockett announced as pages distributed documents to members. These are the minutes from the final bipartisan negotiation session on the Border Security Act, dated exactly 2 weeks ago. She highlighted a section on the screen, visible to the entire chamber. Page 3 clearly shows Speaker Johnson's personal commitment that, and I quote, no substantial changes will be made to the enforcement provisions in sections 4 through 7 as agreed upon by this working group. Every member of that working group, Republican and Democrat, relied on that assurance when agreeing to support the bill. The C-SPAN cameras panned across the chamber, capturing Republican members hurriedly reviewing the documents while Johnson conferred with the House parliamentarian. Yet the final text, Crockett continued, contains exactly 17 substantive alterations to those sections. These weren't minor technical corrections, but fundamental changes that significantly weakened enforcement mechanisms and created new exemptions not discussed in any bipartisan forum. She displayed a side-by-side comparison on the screen. For example, Section 4EB3 originally required compliance verification within 30 days. The final text extends this to 180 days and adds a provision allowing for unlimited 90-day extensions. This completely undermines the enforcement timeline that moderate Democrats insisted upon as a condition of their support. Murmurs spread through the Democratic side of the chamber, particularly among the moderates who had voted for the bill. Several were visibly confronting their staff with the documents, pointing to specific sections with expressions of growing anger. Johnson finally stood. "Point of order, Mr. Speaker," he said, addressing the member temporarily presiding over the session. "The gentlewoman from Texas is mischaracterizing routine legislative refinements and attempting to ascribe nefarious intent to standard procedural adjustments." "I appreciate the Speaker's characterization," Crockett replied calmly, "but let's examine Exhibit B." The screen displayed new documents. These are emails between the Speaker's chief legislative aide and representatives of the Border Industry Coalition, a lobbying group for private detention contractors. Johnson's face tightened visibly as Crockett continued. This email, sent 3 days after the bipartisan agreement and 2 days before the final text was released, includes an attachment titled Proposed Modifications to Enforcement Provisions. When we compare this document, created by private industry lobbyists, to the final bill text, we find that 15 of the 17 changes made to the enforcement sections match this document word for word. The chamber erupted in conversation. Democratic members were on their feet, while Republicans huddled in concerned groups. The presiding officer banged his gavel repeatedly, struggling to restore order. An unexpected complication arose when Representative Jim Jordan, a key Johnson ally, approached the well of the House, apparently intending to interrupt. Crockett held up her hand. "I still have my time, and I intend to use it," she said firmly. "The evidence isn't complete." Jordan reluctantly returned to his seat as Crockett displayed Exhibit C. "This is perhaps the most troubling document of all," she said. A text message exchange between Speaker Johnson and the president of Border Industry Coalition, dated the day before final text release, where the speaker writes, and I quote, "Changes implemented as discussed. Dems won't notice until after passage. We'll call you after the vote." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Johnson's face had gone from concerned to ashen. Democratic members looked shocked, while Republicans appeared divided between those rallying protectively around their speaker and others distancing themselves with visible discomfort. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, addressing Johnson directly, "would you like to explain to this body, particularly the Democratic members who voted for this legislation in good faith, why you assured them no substantive changes would be made while secretly working with industry lobbyists to undermine core enforcement provisions?" Johnson stood again, his composure visibly strained. "These allegations are taken entirely out of context. The communications were part of standard stakeholder outreach to ensure practical implementation. No commitments were violated in spirit or intent." "The documentary evidence suggests otherwise," Crockett replied. She displayed a split screen showing the bipartisan agreement language alongside the lobbyist recommendations and final bill text. "These aren't interpretations, but direct textual comparisons. The enforcement mechanisms that secured Democratic support were systematically weakened according to industry requests, without any notification to the members who negotiated them. The tension in the chamber had reached unprecedented levels. The gavel banged continuously as members from both parties shouted for recognition. "I have 1 minute remaining," Crockett announced over the chaos, her voice somehow cutting through, "and I want to use it to address not just what happened, but why it matters." The room gradually quieted, all eyes fixed on the freshman representative who had just upended the chamber's power dynamics. "This isn't simply about policy disagreement," she said, her voice now measured and deliberate. "This is about whether we can function as a legislative body. When members cannot trust that agreements made in good faith will be honored, the entire foundation of our work collapses. When private interests can secretly rewrite legislation after bipartisan agreement, we cease to be representatives of the people." She turned to face the entire chamber rather than just Johnson. "I entered Congress believing that despite our deep disagreements, basic integrity in our processes remained sacred. Today, I'm calling on members of both parties to prove that's still true. With perfect timing, Crockett's 5 minutes expired just as she finished her statement. The impact of her precisely executed presentation hung in the air as the presiding officer, looking visibly shaken, announced, "The gentlewoman's time has expired." But it was clear to everyone in the chamber and millions watching at home that something far more significant than time had just run out. The chamber remained in stunned silence for several seconds after Crockett's time expired. Then, as if a dam had broken, chaos erupted. Democratic members were on their feet, some shouting for Johnson's immediate response, others calling for an emergency ethics committee meeting. Republican reactions split visibly. Leadership gathered protectively around Johnson while moderate members stood apart, many looking troubled as they reviewed the documents Crockett had distributed. The presiding officer banged his gavel desperately. "The House will be in order! The House will be in order!" Finally, Majority Leader Steve Scalise managed to be recognized. "Mr. Speaker, I move that the House stand in recess subject to the call of the chair." Before the motion could be considered, Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries was on his feet. "Objection! The House deserves an immediate response to these extraordinary allegations. The Speaker must address this body now." The parliamentarian huddled urgently with the presiding officer, who looked increasingly overwhelmed by the procedural crisis unfolding. In the midst of this confusion, Johnson himself approached the well of the House, signaling his desire to speak. The chamber quieted immediately, all eyes fixed on the Speaker. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations," Johnson began, his voice steadier than his expression. "What Representative Crockett has presented is a fundamentally flawed narrative built on selective evidence and mischaracterized communications." He straightened his posture, attempting to project authority. The changes to the final text were technical corrections implementing the spirit of our bipartisan agreement while ensuring practical enforceability. Input was sought from various stakeholders, including industry experts with implementation experience. This is standard legislative practice. Johnson turned to face the Democratic side. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was done in bad faith. If some members misunderstood the nature of certain provisions, I regret that confusion. But there was no intent to deceive. It was a practiced response that might have sufficed in normal circumstances. But Crockett, still standing at her podium, raised a single document visible to both Johnson and the cameras. It was the text message she had displayed earlier. "Changes implemented as discussed. Dems won't notice until after passage. We'll call you after the vote." Johnson fell silent mid-sentence, his prepared explanation colliding with the stark reality of his own words. The chamber watched as the Speaker of the House visibly struggled to reconcile his claims of transparency with the evidence contradicting them. In this moment of hesitation, a remarkable thing happened. Representative Don Bacon, a moderate Republican from Nebraska, rose to speak. "Mr. Speaker, point of personal privilege," Bacon said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the institutional damage unfolding. "As a member who worked on this legislation in good faith, I must ask, are the documents presented by Representative Crockett authentic? Did you assure our bipartisan working group that no substantive changes would be made while allowing industry lobbyists to rewrite enforcement provisions?" The question, coming not from a Democratic opponent, but from within Johnson's own party, landed like a thunderclap. The chamber fell silent again as all eyes turned to Johnson. The Speaker's response would define not just his leadership, but potentially the future functioning of the House itself. He looked across the chamber, from his loyal supporters to the growing number of troubled faces on both sides of the aisle. "The communications occurred," Johnson finally admitted, his voice notably quieter, "but they've been presented without full context. The changes were within my authority as Speaker to implement." An audible gasp spread through the chamber. It wasn't a full admission, but neither was it a denial of the core allegations. Representative Bacon remained standing. "With respect, Mr. Speaker, authority is not the issue. The issue is trust. If we cannot trust that bipartisan agreements will be honored, how can we function as a legislative body?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as more Republican members visibly separated themselves from their leadership. What had begun as a 5-minute speech by a freshman Democrat had escalated into a full-blown crisis of confidence in the speaker. Sensing the shifting momentum, Democratic leader Jeffries rose again. In light of these extraordinary circumstances, I move that the House establish a special bipartisan committee to investigate the allegations regarding the Border Security Act and report its findings within 14 days. Remarkably, it was Representative Bacon who spoke next. I second the motion and urge my Republican colleagues to support this investigation. If we believe in transparency and integrity, we should welcome the opportunity to establish the full facts. Johnson stood frozen at the podium, watching as the foundation of his authority crumbled in real time. The presiding officer, clearly uncertain how to proceed amid this unprecedented breakdown in party discipline, looked desperately toward the parliamentarian. In this moment of procedural confusion, Crockett spoke again, her voice clear but no longer confrontational. This isn't about partisan advantage. This is about whether agreements made across the aisle mean anything. Every member of this body, regardless of party, has a stake in preserving that basic trust. The simplicity and truth of her statement seemed to resonate across the chamber. Members on both sides nodded, the shared recognition that something fundamental to their institution had been threatened, transcending, however briefly, their partisan divisions. As leadership from both parties huddled with the parliamentarian to determine next steps, the cameras captured Johnson sitting alone at the leadership desk, the physical isolation reflecting his suddenly precarious political position. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were spreading across social media, with particular focus on Johnson's damning text message and his inability to directly refute the allegations. What had begun as a routine 5-minute floor speech had transformed into one of the most consequential congressional confrontations in recent memory, exposing not just potential deception in a single bill, but raising fundamental questions about the integrity of the legislative process itself. The impact of Crockett's 5-minute takedown reverberated far beyond the House chamber. Within the first hour, Johnson exposed and Crockett receipts were trending nationwide. News alerts buzzed on phones across Washington as major networks interrupted regular programming to cover what CNN's Jake Tapper was already calling one of the most dramatic congressional confrontations in modern history. What we witnessed today wasn't just political theater, explained former House parliamentarian Charles Johnson on MSNBC. Representative Crockett presented documented evidence that the Speaker of the House had secretly altered bipartisan legislation after agreement, potentially violating both House rules and the basic trust necessary for Congress to function. Outside the chamber, journalists swarmed representatives seeking reactions. The partisan divide in responses was notable, but not absolute. Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't hide her amazement. What Congresswoman Crockett did today was extraordinary. She didn't just make accusations, she brought receipts. This is accountability in real time. Republican reactions revealed growing internal divisions. Johnson loyalists dismissed the evidence as selective and lacking context, while moderate Republicans expressed serious concerns. Representative Bacon expanded on his floor comments to reporters. If these allegations prove accurate, they represent a fundamental breach of trust in our legislative process. That's not a partisan issue. That's about the integrity of this institution. By evening, the political fallout had intensified dramatically. After an emergency Republican conference meeting that reportedly became heated, Johnson issued a written statement. I take concerns about legislative transparency seriously. While communications with stakeholders are a normal part of the process, I regret any impression that changes to the Border Security Act were made secretively or in bad faith. I welcome a thorough examination of the facts. The statement's carefully worded non-denial only fueled further scrutiny. On Fox News, even typically supportive hosts pressed Republican guests on whether the speaker had violated trusts. Whatever your politics, noted conservative commentator Guy Benson, when you tell members one thing and text industry representatives the opposite, that creates a serious credibility problem. The overnight polling showed immediate public impact. Johnson's approval rating dropped 14 points in the first post-confrontation survey. More concerning for Republican leadership, 62% of independent voters and even 41% of Republicans said they found Crockett's evidence concerning or very concerning. Behind closed doors, political calculations intensified. Democratic leadership, recognizing the potential impact on midterm elections, announced they would force a floor vote on establishing the Special Investigation Committee if Republicans didn't agree to it voluntarily. Meanwhile, reports emerged of moderate Republicans privately discussing whether Johnson's position remained tenable. For Crockett, the aftermath brought a dramatic elevation in national prominence. Her methodical, evidence-based approach earned praise even from unexpected quarters. Whatever you think of her politics, wrote conservative columnist Jonah Goldberg, Crockett demonstrated how congressional oversight should work, with specific evidence rather than vague accusations. 3 days after the confrontation, in a move that shocked Washington, 23 moderate House Republicans joined Democrats in voting to establish a bipartisan special committee to investigate the allegations regarding the Border Security Act. The motion passed 255-180, representing a stunning rebuke to Johnson's leadership and a vindication of Crockett's approach. In a further blow to Johnson's authority, Republican Representatives Don Bacon, Brian Fitzpatrick, and Nancy Mace issued a joint statement explaining their votes. The integrity of the legislative process must transcend party. When serious questions arise about whether bipartisan agreements were honored, all members, regardless of party, have a duty to seek the truth. The special committee was structured to include equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, with moderate Republican Mike Turner appointed as chair and Crockett herself as vice chair. The appointment of Crockett to leadership of the investigation acknowledged her role in exposing the issue, while also establishing her as a rising force in Congress. For Johnson, the political damage continued to mount. A week after the confrontation, the conservative Washington Examiner published new documents supporting Crockett's allegations, including additional text messages between Johnson's staff and industry representatives discussing how to work around troublesome enforcement provisions without alerting Democratic supporters. As pressure intensified, Johnson took the extraordinary step of addressing the Republican conference behind closed doors. According to multiple sources who attended, he offered a more direct acknowledgement than his public statements. "I made mistakes in how the final bill was handled. I believe the changes were necessary for implementation, but I should have been transparent about them with all members who worked on the legislation." Trust once broken is difficult to abandon. 7 freemen were hired. The most representatives failed to quell the growing revolt. 2 weeks after Crockett's 5 minutes on the House floor, Republican Representative Ken Buck of Colorado became the first to publicly call for Johnson's resignation as Speaker. Trust once broken is difficult to restore. For the good of the institution and our ability to govern, Speaker Johnson should step aside. While not immediately fatal to Johnson's speakership, Buck's statement opened the floodgates. Within days, 5 additional Republican representatives expressed similar sentiments, with more reportedly considering their positions. The special committee's investigation proceeded with remarkable speed and seriousness. Unlike many congressional investigations that devolved into partisan theater, this committee, perhaps because it originated from a breach of bipartisan trust, conducted its work with notable focus and cooperation. After 2 weeks of document collection and witness interviews, the committee released preliminary findings that substantiated Crockett's core allegations. Johnson had indeed authorized substantive changes to enforcement provisions after bipartisan agreement. The changes matched language provided by industry lobbyists, and efforts had been made to conceal these alterations from Democratic supporters until after passage. The evidence is unambiguous, the preliminary report stated. Commitments made during bipartisan negotiations were not honored in the final legislation, and the changes were implemented in a manner designed to avoid detection until after the vote. The report, signed by all committee members, including Republicans, represented a devastating blow to Johnson's remaining authority. Within hours of its release, House Republican Whip Tom Emmer requested an emergency conference meeting to discuss leadership options. 3 days later, in a development that would have seemed unthinkable a month earlier, Mike Johnson announced he would step down as Speaker while remaining in Congress. To allow our conference and this institution to move forward without distraction, he stated, "I believe it is best for me to step aside from leadership at this time." The resignation represented a stunning validation of Crockett's 5-minute confrontation. A freshman representative had effectively ended the speakership of her chamber's highest official through nothing more than meticulously presented evidence of his actions. Beyond the immediate political consequences, the episode triggered broader reflection about congressional function. Editorial boards across the political spectrum, from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post, published pieces examining how the legislative process had become so distorted that such deception could occur. The Crockett-Johnson confrontation exposed a deeper institutional crisis, wrote congressional scholar Norman Ornstein. When even explicitly bipartisan agreements can be secretly undermined between negotiation and final text, the basic trust necessary for legislation becomes impossible. For Crockett personally, the experience transformed her from a promising junior representative to a national figure in governmental accountability. "I didn't come to Congress looking for this fight," she explained during a 60 Minutes interview a month after the confrontation. "But when I discovered evidence that our legislative process had been compromised, I had a responsibility to act, regardless of the political consequences." Perhaps most significantly, her approach became a model studied by members of both parties. The Crockett method, as some began calling it, emphasized thorough investigation, specific documentary evidence, and principled rather than partisan framing of accountability issues. What made Crockett's presentation so devastating wasn't just the evidence itself, noted a Politico analysis, but how she presented it as a defense of institutional integrity rather than a partisan attack. That framing made it possible for Republicans to support investigation without feeling they were betraying their party. 6 months later, with a new speaker leading the House and enhanced rules governing the finalization of bill text, the institutional impact of those 5 minutes continued to resonate. Bipartisan working groups had established new verification procedures for final text, and both parties had embraced a heightened emphasis on legislative transparency. "Sometimes in politics, 5 minutes can change everything," concluded a retrospective in The Atlantic. Crockett's confrontation with Johnson may be remembered not just for its immediate political consequences, but for briefly clarifying something essential about democratic governance: that across all our divisions, a shared commitment to basic honesty in our processes remains the foundation upon which everything else depends. As this story continues to impact American politics, we'll bring you the latest developments and analysis. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay informed about the continuing evolution of congressional accountability in the wake of this historic confrontation. Your support makes it possible for us to bring you in-depth coverage of the stories that reveal how power truly works in Washington and the rare moments when courageous individuals manage to hold it accountable.